The Holocaust became the focus of a trial in London last month when the historian David Irving sued an American writer for libel and lost. Irving, who claimed that there were no systematic gassings of Jews in Auschwitz, was branded by the judge as an active Holocaust denier, anti-Semitic and racist, and an associate of right-wing extremists who promote Nazism. Why does he think he lost so badly? David Irving, welcome to the programme.
Yes, hello.
In the introduction to the new edition of Hitler's War, you quote what you call a scornful adage, and you say, to historians is granted a talent that even the gods are denied to alter what has already happened. Was that you giving the game away and telling us exactly what you've been doing in history since 1988?
I'd add a category to that. Not only historians can do it, but apparently lawyers can also do it.
But you did it in this case, according to the judge, didn't you?
No, I don't agree, and I had to be careful what I say about in commenting on the trial because we're going to go to appeal on this. So I had to be careful not to try and second-guess the judge.
Well, the record of the judge already stands, what he said, doesn't
yes.
he? I mean, Irving has, for his own ideological reasons, persistently and deliberately misrepresented and manipulated historical evidence.
Yeah, this isn't the view of a lot of historians, but of course...
Well, it is the view of a lot of historians, isn't it?
A lot of historians, there's a consensus of historians who obviously don't like me, and I must admit that if I was invited to be an expert witness in this case, as several historians were, for the defence, and I'd been offered £100,000 to testify against David Irving, then I would find it difficult to refuse as well, and that was the amount of money that was poured into this case.
So you're saying Professor Richard Evans, Professor of Modern History at Cambridge, deliberately lied and falsified his version of events or his record on you for money?
Oh, no, I can't say that, of course. He was paid...
Well, that's what you are saying.
He was paid £76,000 to write a report, and that gave him the confidence that he needed in order to smear me from one end of the country and, in fact, around the world.
Well, he didn't smear you, did he?
Yes.
He said what he thought, your record was like.
Yeah, without having heard me cross-examine him in the witness box, and he turned out to be not exactly expert on the history of the Third Reich. In fact, his knowledge of German was, on occasions, lamentable. I was astonished that a person of his qualifications can rise to be a professor of history at Cambridge. But
he was astonished by you. He said he wasn't prepared for the sheer depth of duplicity in your treatment of sources. I wouldn't trust him about what he said Hitler had for breakfast.
Yes, he wouldn't throw me as far as he would throw a grand piano either.
Well, he's not alone in that, is he?
But if you read the judge's verdict, you'll see the judge also says, I don't agree with a lot of the negative things that Evans in particular has had to say about Mr. Irving. Pity the judge wasn't specific about what he didn't agree with.
Well, you still lost, didn't he? He still found against you, whatever nice things the judge may have said as well. He certainly didn't retract the other things. He said for the same reason he's portrayed Hitler in an unwarrantedly favourable light, particularly in relation to his attitude towards responsibility for the treatment of the Jews, misinterpreting and mistranslating documents.
I think when we come to misinterpreting and mistranslating documents, the Court of Appeal will have something to say about the judge in this case. I have to be very careful what I say here.
And if it doesn't?
Then of course, I go down in flames.
Judgment stands?
Then I crash in flames.
We already have, haven't you?
We're crashing in flames, but you've got to realise I was a lone litigant in this case, facing people who had poured about £10 million into defending the action that I had brought.
Into finding out the truth.
If the truth was there in the archives, hidden for the last 55 years, it shouldn't have taken £10 million to prove me wrong. And at the end of the day, the judge was rather scratching his head in his judgment. The judge says, I had always assumed that there was the evidence that Auschwitz had gas chambers, and I was surprised to find that there wasn't until this case came along.
It wasn't documentary evidence, is what he said. Didn't say there wasn't any evidence.
Yes.
He said there wasn't documentary evidence.
There were eyewitnesses, and he relies on half a dozen eyewitnesses, and that's not good enough for me. I'm afraid I want to see documents. If all the shootings on the Eastern Front are documented, there's no doubt that the Nazis killed millions of Jews on the Eastern Front, and we've got any number of documents on that, but nothing for the gas chambers.
Talking of relying on documents, you seem to have relied for your central thesis that there was no mass gassing of Jews in Auschwitz on a man called Friedrich Leuchter, who had no formal training in engineering or forensic science, but took some samples from brickwork and plasterwork in Auschwitz and converted you overnight in 1988 to his findings.
Yes, I don't think no formal training stands against him. As I pointed out in...
Well, he wasn't a forensic scientist, was he?
In the cross-examination of their chief witness, Professor Van Pelt, who is a professor of architecture in Canada. It turns out he never qualified as an architect. He would be arrested if he called himself an architect, and yet he was paid £109,000 to give evidence against me in this case. This is the odd kind of case I found myself in. I found myself baffled by the way the legal system works.
But you acknowledged there were flaws in the Leuchter report. I mean, you said criticism of the Leuchter report had to be taken on board. These are your words.
Yes.
And that probably concessions have to be made at both ends of this scale. So despite defending this man's integrity and his scrupulous methods, you still acknowledged that there were errors in his report.
No, when I published his report in June 1989, in the introduction I said it's a pity that there are things that forensically one would have liked to have seen done differently. It's flawed, and I said that at the time, but the forensic tests were carried out...
But you also said you were converted by it.
I was
converted by a flawed report.
I was converted by the laboratory tests that the flawed report contained. There had been lab tests conducted on the fabric of the so-called gas chambers at Auschwitz, which found no significant traces of cyanide, which is what set my mind thinking, I have to admit.
Leuchter claimed that the samples of concrete taken from the walls at Auschwitz gas chambers contained quantities of hydrogen cyanide that were too low to kill human beings, and thus he suggested the chambers were for delousing. But as it came out at the trial, the truth was the reverse. The real amount of hydrogen cyanide needed to kill humans is 20 times lower than that needed to kill lice. That's a convincing argument, isn't it?
It isn't. It's a very clever kind of argument used by the defence lawyers. But if you've got a gas
clever kind of argument used by you on a lot of occasions.
If you've got a so-called gas chamber, a room about this size in which allegedly 500,000 people have been gassed by cyanide, and you find there's no significant trace whatsoever of cyanide left in the concrete now, and there should be, because it turns into a very permanent substance called Prussian blue. That sets my mind thinking. And the tests have been replicated since then by other reputable scientists, and the same result has come up. And there's other reasons also for doubting this, not just the forensic tests.
How saddened are you by the state of your reputation? I mean, you went...
Sad's not the word. I'm horrified.
You went to court, in a sense, to salvage a reputation that you no longer had.
I had no choice. The enemies of the truth, as I call them, were conducting a mudslide, and the mudslide was building up, and it was being financed on a colossal scale around the world with a single dedicated aim of destroying David Irving.
What about your colossal support? I mean, you've had, 4,000 supporters around the world?
They don't have the kind of money that Steven Spielberg has.
How do we know?
Well, I can tell you they don't.
Well, you don't tell us who they are.
I've thrown my records open to a journalist of the Jewish Chronicle. I said, here you are, have a look at the computer. You can look at them. He sat there 15 minutes going through all the records. And I said, as long as you don't write down names, you can look to your heart's content. I'm that open.
So where have you taken money from?
We have a very broad base of supporters around the world. People who give me the smallest amount, I suppose, $2. The largest amount is $50,000.
But you take money from any group, anywhere?
If
Ku Klux Klan,
if there's no strings attached to it, I will take money from whoever will support my legal fight.
No money too dirty for you to take?
Oh, come on. Have you seen the kind of money that's been poured into this case by my opponents?
I'm asking you the kind of money that you would take.
This is a really dirty fight being fought against me. This is money being fought
Why is it
by
a dirty
the
fight?
big money.
They would say that you distorted the truth.
We've only just found out, after the case was over, how much money was paid to the witnesses. We've only just found out, after the trial was over, where the money came from.
And paying expert witnesses isn't unique to this trial, is it?
I'm sad to hear it. I'm sad to hear this. I didn't pay my witnesses a penny. They spoke because they spoke from their expertise. They spoke from their knowledge as professors and as historians.
So you see this as a giant conspiracy, and a Jewish conspiracy,
yes,
against Irving.
I'm sorry to say that this is...
Poor Irving, David against Goliath.
Yes, for the last, I suppose, 20 years, the various bodies, it's not the Jews as such, it's just certain self-appointed leaders of the Jewish community, who quite demonstrably, because we have the documents, they were in court. They weren't relevant. The judge quite rightly said, these aren't relevant to the case, Mr. Irving. But I put them in just because I wanted the world to know what I've been up against for the last 20 years.
You've enjoyed the publicity attendant with this case?
There were two exhilarating qualities. The exhilaration of standing in the High Court and cross-examining witnesses and see them crumble.
In your best Savile Row suit?
In my best Savile Row suit.
Which made you feel superior?
Which made me feel immensely superior to the kind of people I was up against, there's no question. I certainly never felt inferior one moment to any of those expert witnesses. I ran rings around them. I made them confess that they had no qualifications. I made them confess they didn't know German.
Yet you still managed to lose. You called the judge Mein Führer at one particular point. Why?
Look at the transcript.
No, I'm asking you.
This is one of those legends.
I'm asking you why.
This is one of those legends.
Well, did you or didn't you?
There's a passage in the transcript where I'm saying what the crowd is calling out to me, of the neo-Nazis now that I'm addressing in Halle, and they're calling out things like Sieg Heil, and they're calling out things like Mein Führer, and I say this, and if you look at that, it's quite plain, and if the journalists wanted to report it the other way, I can't be responsible for them.
One of the additional charges was that you misinterpreted evidence. Now, a document crucial to you was a telegram from Hitler's headquarters, November 1941, requiring that one transport of Jews from Berlin to the east should not be liquidated. The document referred to one transport of Jews. And you misconstrued this to mean that no transport of Jews should be murdered.
Well,
Why?
Tim, I'm sure you know German. If you see the German word Judentransport, just by itself, with no context at all, the word transport can mean transportation, the transportation of Jews. Or it can mean a single transport. And without the context to know exactly what was going on, I translated that back in 1977. I was the first person to transcribe Himmler's handwriting. That's why I found it. I said the transports of Jews from Berlin have to stop. No liquidation. But very rapidly, another expert, Gerald Fleming, who's a British historian, contacted me. He said, no, this refers to a particular trainload, David. This is a well-known trainload that went to Riga. And in the next edition of the book, I changed it. These are the kind of misinterpretations that go on the whole time when you're pioneering in history, when you're reading somebody's handwritten documents nobody else has ever bothered to read. You make errors of interpretation.
So you acknowledge errors of interpretation?
Yes, good Lord.
And mistranslations?
Yes. If
out of a desire to get them to say what you wish they would have said.
That's what the judge says. That's what the judge said, but that interpretation I totally reject. You've got the two kinds of historians.
You didn't convince him, did you?
No, I didn't. In court, and I said on the last day in the court, when he finished reading out his judgment, I stood up and I said, my lord, I have to admit that I've obviously failed to convince you, and I blame myself that I'm not able to persuade you that the historical documents have to be read the way that they should be read, and it's my fault, and the next time round when we come to the Court of Appeal, we will rectify that.
You hope?
Yes. Well, no question.
Of course there's a question. There's a huge question over it.
Well, there's a question whether the Court of Appeal even allows me to appeal. That's the first hurdle we have to cross. And there's a question whether we can raise the £100,000 that's going to be necessary in order to establish the security for costs, which will undoubtedly be required by the defendants in this action.
On the allegations...
It's all about money, you see. It's about people with
wealth. It isn't
wealth.
It's about money. It's about the truth, and it's about your reputation,
It's about multimillionaires fighting somebody who hasn't got the means to defend himself, namely myself, and I'm doing the best I can.
It's not a question of means. It's a question of whether you actually told the truth or not.
Yes,
it doesn't matter what's spent to try and prove the truth. That's what this whole trial was about, wasn't it? It wasn't about money, it was about the truth.
No, it wasn't. It was about
And you've
money.
done everybody a favour, in many people's eyes, by proving that these theories of yours were false.
It wasn't. It was about money.
Right from day one.
If the truth was as plainly written as they made out, they wouldn't have needed to have a courtroom filled with 30 lawyers and historians and experts and research assistants and all the rest of it, who had spent 20 man-years to try and prove me wrong.
You did the favour
£5
of getting them to have it conclusively proved, didn't you?
No, we didn't. We spent no money at all. We paid no money at all on producing the...
No, I said you did them a favour of getting them. You persuaded them to spend a lot of money to prove that your views were conclusively
I don't think so. I think
false.
if anybody reads the transcript, they will say, that's funny. The eyewitnesses say there was holes in the roof where they poured the cyanide in through, and yet the roof is there and there's no holes.
Other people have argued that consistently.
Says,
I mean, this is something you've come out with. It's been comprehensively challenged in court, time and time again.
I said to the defendants halfway through the trial, whinging about the money this case is costing, if you go to Auschwitz tonight and scrape the mud off that roof and find the holes in the roof on the top side, you can't see them from the bottom side. If you find the holes in the roof, then I will capitulate. Tomorrow I'll come to court and I'll wind up the whole action. And they didn't dare to go.
Why did the judge talk about overwhelming convergence?
The judge said, and I have to admit there are Englishmen like this, the judge said, I believe the eyewitnesses and not the roof. And this is where I can only say, well, you paid your money and you take your choice.
David Irving, when asked if you're a racist, you talked about an emotional, instinctive aversion to people from other cultures.
Yes.
You have that.
I'm that honest, yes. I mean, I could just have stood in the witness box and said, no, I'm not a racist, but
you acknowledge being a racist.
I don't think I'm probably any more racist than you are or anybody else.
We're not comparing. I'm talking about you. You would classify yourself as a racist. You have done. You've said I'm a racist.
No, I haven't. I haven't said I'm a racist.
You did.
This is a typical thing taken out of context. There's this film on Fred Leuchter where the producer said, Mr. Irving, put yourself in various positions. Now imagine you're a communist, now imagine you're a Jew, now imagine you're a racist. And when we came to the one that began with, now I'm a racist, I began by saying, right, now I'm a racist, and I say that. And that's all they quoted.
You said that in one of your comments about the Jews. I would say that as a race, they are better at making money than I am. That's a racist remark. This is you talking. So? No, this is you talking. Yes. That's a racist remark. If I was going to be crude, I would say that not only are they better at making money, but they are greedy. Yeah. So you write off the whole Jewish nation as greedy. You don't think that's a racist comment?
That's my perception of them.
But that is a racist comment, isn't it?
I don't think so. It's a perception of the way the Jews are and the way that I see them in the newspapers. And
you see them as greedy. You've written them off as greedy. greedy.
Well, as a result of their campaign over the last 5 years to lay their hand on all the Swiss gold and to beat up the French
Well, you don't just talk
companies,
about the last 5
Italian.
years, you talk about the last 3,000 years. They've been hated for the last 3,000
This
years.
is another problem. I agree this is a problem which they themselves are not addressing enough attention to it. If I was a Jew, and I frequently say this, and I found myself being put into a pit and machine gunned to death with my family, I would want to know in my last few dying seconds, why are they doing it to me? Why is it us Jews, again and again, who are being victimized like this? There must be some reason for it. There must be something in the human microchip, which I think is just straightforward.
To which you always wish to draw attention to as a stick to beat them.
I don't think so. I think it's xenophobia. I think there's an element of xenophobia in everybody. And
is your xenophobia when you say, if you're a man and you go into a men's public toilet and there's a black man or Pakistani standing at one stall, then you go 2 or 3 stalls possibly further away?
It's instinct, yes. It's the little...
It's a racist instinct, isn't it?
The microchip kicks in and I think you'll probably find that millions of people around the world listening to this will say, well,
why do
I
you
have to
justify
admit,
yourself by
right.
saying, well, millions of other people feel the same thing? There's no scientific evidence to suggest that millions of people feel the same thing. Do you feel in better company saying these things by thinking, oh, well, there are plenty of other people out there who feel the same way?
Well, I've been around the world and
Does that somehow justify your views?
I've been around the world and I've spoken to other human beings and I know
millions
how
of
they feel.
them, presumably.
No, but I've a reasonable cross-section
You quote
of them.
millions of them.
A reasonable cross-section of them. And I suspect strongly there's millions of people out there who say, yeah,
you suspect.
David
So
Irving's
it's not
right.
a scientific fact. It's what you suspect. You said, you told The Independent once you recalled seeing a black man on a bicycle coming towards you in Florida. And the moment he became confused and couldn't decide whether to go this way or that, he crashed into me and nearly broke my finger. I screamed at him, "You stupid nigger."
I told The Independent, I'd never actually revealed that story before. I told The Independent that I was so ashamed of that having happened that when I went home to my little cottage on the island where I stay in America, where no one could see, I went down on my knees and I pleaded to God for forgiveness. And it's just totally unforgivable. I've never used that word before. I've never used it since. I would find it difficult to say it even now.
It was pretty close to hand when you wanted it, wasn't it? I mean, it was just right there on the tip of your tongue.
It is inside your
it?
brain, buried somewhere in an ugly corner of your brain, and in a moment of great pain it comes out and you wish you hadn't said it, and you know that he's seen you and he's heard you saying it, and you go and apologize. And that's all you can do.
What about the charge of inciting racial hatred?
Well, I think that's an odious charge. And I don't know how anyone could possibly accuse me of
Well,
of
you've acknowledged that you're tasteless.
I'm tasteless enough to say that people who are...
In rebutting stories about Auschwitz, you've actually recommended being tasteless.
What do you think? Is that
in
racial hatred?
In 1991, a speech at Calgary, you said the only way to overcome the pseudo-religious atmosphere...
is to use tastelessness.
Yes, is to treat these little legends with the ridicule and bad taste they deserve. You've got to say things like, more women died on the back seat of Senator Edward Kennedy's car at Chappaquiddick than died in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Why is it the business of a historian to be so tasteless and so hurtful to people who may have had relatives who suffered or died at Auschwitz, to ram your views down their throat?
But suppose that particular statement is true. If
the more people died on the back seat of Senator Edward Kennedy's
in that fake gas chamber at Auschwitz.
Well, you know it's
the one
not.
They show the one they show the tourists was built in 1948.
You know it's not.
The Poles have admitted it was built in 1948, and nobody will hear it.
Repaired. Nobody said it was built for the first time.
It's a totally fake building. They built a chimney behind it, which isn't even connected to the main building.
A lot of Auschwitz was in ruins, as you know.
It's like Disneyland, and the only way you can get people to realise...
It was in ruins.
No.
There are plans that exist.
They have even Van Pelt...
You know that. There are plans to exist.
Even their £100,000 expert admits that what they show the tourists is fake. He's written a whole chapter about it.
So tasteless? Why so needlessly hurtful?
You have to be tasteless because it is the
Why
only way to bring this
tasteless?
Extraordinary fact home to the world that what they show the tourists in Auschwitz is largely fake. They've destroyed the integrity. There's no doubt that tens or even hundreds of thousands of people died at Auschwitz from various causes.
And you don't have the slightest qualm using language like this, designed to hurt and wound people.
You have to, in this case.
Who else does?
One has
Nobody
to,
else
in this
does.
case.
You feel you have to.
Because over the whole of the Auschwitz complex has been put this glass cheese cover, so to speak, and no one's allowed to go near it and lift up the cheese cover and say, I want to investigate that, because they put this word Holocaust over the top, and they made it a criminal offence in many countries around the world, even to look at what happened in Auschwitz. And look what happened to me when I started questioning Auschwitz. And that should make people suspicious.
Well, let's look what
Yes.
happened to you. I mean, speaking for right-wing organisations in Germany, the DVU, the Deutsche Volksunion, what's their creed? I mean, you take it off their website. Denial of Wehrmacht crimes and of German war guilt in general, mass murder of German civilians by the Allies, the recreation of Greater Germany. Why do you speak for people like that?
When I was first invited to go and speak to the German People's Union, it was about 1984, I wrote a letter to the German embassy, being a cautious person, and I said, I've been invited to speak to this body. Will you tell me, are they lawful? Are they constitutional? Do you recommend me not to? And the German embassy wrote me back a very nice letter saying they are perfectly lawful.
I didn't say they weren't lawful. I told you these were the views they espoused.
Constitutional body, and there are no reasons why you shouldn't address this organisation.
You agree with the views they espouse?
No, I don't. But what I do...
Well, why do you address them then?
It is useful that I go and speak to these people, many of whom are incorrigible, many of whom even I would find incorrigible. So you can imagine how incorrigible they are. And I give them a taste of the truth. I read out to
the truth that they like, the truth that happens to coincide with their views. Why are you fated by these people?
I have read
You're
out.
The darling of these right-wing groups.
Because I'm regarded as the bringer of truth and totally unparteiisch. I'm totally impartial between the warring parties.
That's why they fade. Impartial enough to attend a dinner in 1990 to mark Hitler's birthday.
Totally untrue.
Held by the well-known neo-Nazi Ewald Althans. It's in your diary. You talked about people rising and toasting.
Have you never had people in your surroundings who on April the 20th say, oh, it's Adolf Hitler's birthday, let's drink a toast to him? You probably haven't.
No, I haven't. No. Have you? You have,
clearly. Members of Parliament in this country.
Clearly.
Alan Clark once came to visit me.
Does it make it better?
He sent me
You always draw attention to what other people are doing. I'm talking about what you do. I'm talking about the kind of company that you keep.
I'm trying to draw attention to normal people with
normal people,
red-blooded,
not in the normal world that I recognise.
Red-blooded sense of humour and red-blooded instincts.
So this is a sense of humour toasting Hitler's birth.
I find it totally tasteless, and that's why I refuse to join in.
Well, you said because you didn't have a glass.
Well, that's the obvious proof that I didn't join in. I find it. That's why I wrote it in my diary. I find it incredibly tasteless that they should do this.
What do you think of Hitler?
Well, it's a rather wide question. It's like, where do you stand on Jesus Christ? So they're two very different personalities.
You admire him?
Let me start at the other end of the question. I was in Johannesburg a few years ago being interviewed by the editor of the City Press, which is a black newspaper, and he was black and his name was Adolf. And I said, how come your name is Adolf? And he said, Mr. Irving, people of the Third World, their parents frequently called their children Adolf in memory of Adolf Hitler. And I was astonished by this, and I said, why? He said, well, because in third world countries they regarded him as the hero and the champion of the underdog. And for a long time that was the case. In the early 1930s he was that way, when he came to power. And until about 1937, 1938, you can say, had he died then, had he fallen victim to an assassin's gun, they would have erected a statue to him in Hitler, in Germany.
Do you admire him?
As a military commander, unquestionably. He withstood the entire combined might of the Allied nations until, for 6 years. He very nearly won World War II. If it had lasted 7 years, he probably would have, because the Allies would have run out of steam. We had no manpower left, and the will to fight had gone.
David Irving.
But I think politically, of course, he went wrong. He was a bad leader. He was a bad dictator. He allowed things at home to go to rot while he ran the war, and you can't do that. That's the basic problem with all dictatorships.
How saddened are you by the fact that various members of your family have rejected your views?
This is what the newspapers say. It's totally untrue.
Well, they quote your daughter Paloma, for instance, saying, I'm completely opposed to his beliefs in terms of women. That's another issue. What he says is a joke. I think she was referring to your description of women as mental chewing gum.
I don't think I said that. I have pointed out the fact that their brains are a marvel of miniaturization. And
your daughter Pilar said, my views and my family's views are totally opposed to his, and anyone who reads what he says must find them totally laughable. Does that upset you?
These daughters have been in touch with me over the last few days to say these quotations are fictitious and invented. I've seen the same thing said about my twin brother.
So they support you fully? A
national newspaper said that I'm at loggerheads with my twin brother, and this is also totally untrue, and one wonders where the newspapers find these things. But you as a journalist, you know this is the way newspapers report. That's why I find live television has such an edge and such an advantage. It's much more honest. Well, you can catch me out, you can bring tears into my eyes by asking me certain questions, but on the other hand, I have a chance to say things as they are.
We'll watch your appeal with interest, David Irving. Thank you very much indeed.